Pentacle Circle. It was a moonless night at my university dormitory. Everything was eerily quiet today. Amidst the darkness, two figures moved with silent purpose. Both of us were seniors, having spent months studying the occult. What started as curiosity had become an obsession. They had found an ancient grimoire buried deep in the library archives, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and spells. One ritual, in particular, had caught our attention, a summoning ritual. The old chapel, adjacent to the library, was my chosen location. It had been abandoned for years. The crumbling walls and shattered pews created an atmosphere of desolation. I entered through a broken window, our footsteps echoing in the hollow space. The air was thick with dust and decay. In the center of the chapel, they arranged the necessary items for the ritual, a circle with a pentacle drawn in paint and candles at each corner. I guessed we weren't the only ones daring enough to try this thrilling and terrifying experience. The air grew colder as we lit the candles, their flames flickering with an unnatural intensity. My friend Ada opened the grimoire, his hands trembling slightly as he began to chant the incantation in Latin. The words were foreign and harsh. I stood opposite Ada, my eyes closed in concentration. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, a palpable tension that set my nerves on edge. As Ada's chanting grew louder, the runes on the floor began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. Suddenly, the flames of the candles shot up, and the room was bathed in a blood-red light of horror. The air grew thick with the stench of sulfur. A low, guttural growl echoed through the chapel, seeming to come from the very walls themselves. Ada's voice wavered, but he pressed on, determined. The ground within the circle started to crack, dark tendrils of smoke seeping through the fissures. The smoke coalesced into a form, a figure with glowing red eyes. It was a shifting mass of darkness and malevolence. It was a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and bone, its form constantly shifting and morphing. The air around it seemed to hum with a sinister energy. It growled, whispering, muttering, hissing something incomprehensible. The malice in its tone was unmistakable. The shadows grew darker as Ata desperately tried to reverse the incantation. The entity's form wavered, but it remained. Its eyes seemed to burn brighter. It reached out with a clawed hand toward us. I grabbed a crucifix and thrust it towards the creature. The entity recoiled, a howl of rage filling the chapel. The shadows writhed and pulsed, but it seemed to grow angrier. He no longer read from the cursed book, but instead frantically recited prayers in a desperate plea. The entity paused, its form flickering, and then, with a final deafening roar, it dissipated into a cloud of smoke. We gasped for breath, our bodies trembling with fear. We stumbled out of the chapel. Behind us, the old building stood silent once more, as if the events of the past hour had never happened. I knew this would be the last time we meddled with such dark forces. We had been lucky to escape with our lives. As I left the chapel, the grimoire lay forgotten on the floor, its pages fluttering in the wind. It served as a reminder that some doors, once open, can never be fully closed. Escape from the terrifying truck. On a Sunday afternoon, Mac and I decided to go hiking in some hills, just an hour's drive from the city. The hill we chose today had a fairly simple trail, not too steep, and when we reached the top, everything felt peaceful, just like any other time we had gone hiking. After a short rest, we started heading down, but just 10 minutes later, Mac began complaining about the rough path. He wanted to take a different trail down. I hesitated but eventually agreed. We hadn't seen another soul since we started our descent. Then we heard the sound of an engine. A rusty, heavy red truck was coming toward us. The man driving rolled down his window and flashed a smile that seemed friendly enough, but something felt off. He offered us a ride. Mac, always trusting, thought the guy seemed nice enough. I wasn't so sure. Mac begged and convinced me to get in, saying it was only a 10-minute drive. I was cautious, but I got in with him. Inside, the truck was shabby but clean. As we settled in, I instinctively started scanning my surroundings. My eyes were drawn to the floor, where I saw a coil of rope behind the driver's seat. Unease began to creep in. 10 minutes passed. We were no closer to the main road, and the woods around us grew denser. I asked the man how much longer it would take. He said we were just taking a different route and that we'd have to stop somewhere to pick up his stuff. We stopped in front of a small cabin, hidden deep in the woods. There was an old tree stump out front, with a large axe stuck in it as if he had been chopping wood. I glanced at Mac, but he seemed excited and trusting of the man. The man turned off the engine and got out of the truck. He said,
"Stay here. I'll be right back."
As soon as he was out of sight, panic started to rise within me. I turned to Mac, pleading with him to leave, not to get out, but he didn't see the danger I saw. That's when I turned back to the truck and saw it. Half hidden under the driver's seat was an axe. Dark stains covered the blade stains that could only be blood. I quickly told Mac to look. He froze, his face turning pale as he realized the danger we were in. Without another word, we bolted into the forest, fleeing the imminent threat. We crashed through the thick underbrush, not caring where we were headed, as long as it was away from that cabin, trying to stay on a trail to avoid getting lost. Finally, the trees began to thin, and I could see the wooden fence surrounding the parking lot. A wave of relief washed over me. But then I saw it. The man's truck was parked on the other side of the lot, engine off, lying in wait like a predator ready to pounce. Mac wanted to run to our car, but I held him back. The parking lot was too wide, too exposed for us to make a safe escape. We hid behind a large tree, cloaked in the darkness. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. As night fell, I heard a sound. The truck's door creaked open. The man climbed out, glancing around the forest once more. Mac made a mistake. He stepped on a branch, causing a snap. The man noticed and lingered for a moment, then started walking toward a nearby tree. We covered our mouths, hearts pounding, afraid to breathe or move as he came dangerously close to where we were hiding. Just then, a forest ranger approached the truck. The man seemed startled or afraid of being caught, so he quickly returned to his truck and drove away. As soon as he was gone, we bolted to our car, not stopping until we were inside with the doors locked. We sped out of there as fast as we could. That night, we drove in silence. The danger was behind us, but the fear lingered. As we finally returned to safety, I couldn't help but think about what might have happened if we had stayed in that truck any longer. When we got back, we reported the incident to the forest rangers so they could investigate and warn other hikers to be more cautious. The Stalker. I worked as a cashier at a home improvement store, and my coworker, Nicole, quickly became my best friend. She was very sweet, a bit shy, and unfortunately, she was often hit on by customers. Most of the time, it was just harmless flirting or a dinner invitation that she politely declined. But one day, something different happened. Nicole told me about a man who had asked her out. She had declined, as usual, saying that she had a boyfriend. The man seemed irritated but left without causing any trouble. Later that day, he came back. Nicole was helping a customer, so I was alone at the counter when he approached me. He looked quite handsome, but there was something about him that made me feel uncomfortable. He spoke in a deep voice and said he was there to see Nicole. I asked how he knew her, and he lied, saying she had agreed to go out with him and that he was there to pick her up. I knew that wasn't true, so I told him she had already left, hoping he would go away. Instead, his expression darkened, and he crossed his arms, asking why he couldn't see her. Thinking quickly, I blurted out, "She's my fiancée." It was a lie, but it was the only thing I could think of to make him back off. His eyes narrowed, and he looked me up and down with disdain.
Someone like her with someone like you?
He scoffed at me. I held my ground, repeating that she wasn't available. He stared at me for a long moment before turning and leaving. I told Nicole what happened when she came back, and she felt creeped out but also found the fiancé excuse quite amusing. We laughed about it, thinking it was over. But 2 weeks later, the man returned, this time after dark. Nicole and I were closing up when we heard a loud bang on the glass door. We both jumped, and there he was, pressing his face against the glass, his eyes wild. "We're closed," I told him, but he didn't move. Nicole shouted at him to go away, but he just stared at us, his breath fogging up the glass. He pointed at me, his eyes full of rage. He yelled,
"I'm not here for her. I'm here for you. If I take out her husband, she'll be mine."
My heart pounded as I realized he intended to kill me. I told Nicole to run to the manager's office and call the police.
911, what's the emergency, please?
As she ran off, the man started ramming the doors, trying to break them down. I was terrified, but I knew I had to keep him outside. I grabbed a 2x4 from behind the counter, ready to defend myself if he got in. The glass doors shook violently, and I was sure they were about to give way. But then Nicole came running back, swinging another piece of wood and yelling that the police were on their way. The man finally stopped, glaring at me one last time before turning and disappearing into the night. The police arrived, but by then, he was long gone. We showed them the security footage, and they promised to keep an eye out for him. A few days later, we heard he had been arrested in a nearby town for stalking another woman. Nicole and I were both shaken by the experience. We quit our jobs shortly after and found safer work. We still talk about that night sometimes, grateful that we had each other's backs. But the memory of his twisted expression and the sound of him trying to break in still haunts me. Screaming in the crematorium. I work at the morgue in the crematorium area. It's not exactly the most glamorous job, but it helps me pay the bills, and that's what's important to me. Plus, I don't exactly hate working there. I've never been the most sociable person, so at least I don't have to deal with many people. Technically, my job isn't much different from filing paperwork in an office job. The tasks involve checking tags on bodies to ensure everything is in its rightful place, placing a body in, cleaning one of the machines for another body, and collecting the ashes. I have to admit, though, that sometimes this job can be a bit more gruesome than office work, especially when dealing with a severely decomposed body or a dismembered cadaver from a medical case. But I've gotten used to things like the smell of burning flesh, human ashes on my clothes, and so on. It was one of those days when I was working alone. We had 5 bodies to cremate and 3 machines. I had placed 2 of the bodies in the machines and was waiting for them to finish. It would would take about 2 hours to cremate one body. Bodies can make sounds when they're burning. Sometimes it's moans or hissing noises. These are just the sounds of gases escaping from the body, a pretty unsettling part of the decomposition process that no one really talks about. But I've mostly learned to tune those sounds out. I had just checked the ID on the body I had placed into the machine, a tiny old woman who had arrived the day before. Her name was Hylis. She had died from a fall and had a horridly long gash on her head. She was definitely dead when I placed her on the conveyor belt. My attention was on the body I had just put in, and as I listened, I could hear it, the faint, indistinct sound of a weak scream. I had never heard a dead body scream before. I thought it was just the air escaping or something like that, so I shrugged it off and went back to preparing the next body. But then I heard a knocking from inside one of the machines. I froze for a moment, and my heart began to race. I turned back to Hylis's machine. She had been burning for nearly an hour. Her body should have been nothing more than charred bones. Yet, I could see movement, hear the banging. The screaming started again, this time louder. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But the banging grew more intense, and the scream turned into a desperate, raspy voice, choking out the words, I stepped back, starting to feel uneasy as something banged against the door again, causing it to warp. But I could swear that the body had moved. Then, the door of the machine buckled. Flames burst out from the sides, and smoke filled the room. The door flew open, and I saw a shadow move through the flames. I held my breath as I realized this was no joke. I stumbled backward, seeing charred, skeletal hands emerge from the door of the machine. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, sprinting toward the door, not stopping until I was out on the street. The smoke alarms were blaring as I reached the door, and the sprinkler system had activated. Sirens wailed in the distance as firefighters arrived on the scene, and they managed to extinguish the flames. The crematorium was reduced to a charred skeleton. The next day, the news reported a mysterious fire at the crematorium, destroying most of the building. The cause remains unknown, and her remains are believed to have been lost in the fire. Makeup for ghosts. Her name was Nara, and she worked as a makeup artist. She had just graduated from school, and it was hard to find a job. Following a recommendation from her friends, she applied for a position at a funeral home. Even though her father had warned her about the dangers of working with the dead, the pay was good, and she saw it as an opportunity to hone her skills. The funeral home was isolated, far from the bustling city. Her job was simple enough, preparing the deceased for burial by applying makeup to their faces. Over time, she became accustomed to her eerie surroundings. One evening, as she was cleaning up and preparing to leave, she was startled by the sudden appearance of a young girl standing behind her. The girl had shy eyes, and her long hair hung over her face, which she habitually kept lowered. Her name was Jen. She explained that she was about to get married but didn't have the money to hire a professional makeup artist. She shyly asked if Nara could help her. It felt strange no one ever came to a funeral home for makeup. She wore old, tattered clothes, and her face lit up when Nara agreed to help. Nara packed her makeup kit and followed her down an old dirt road. The journey to her house took over an hour, winding through dark woods. When they finally arrived, Jen's house was small and crumbling. Jen invited Nara into the house and apologized for making her walk so far. Nara prepared her makeup tools, ready to begin. These were the same tools Nara used on the dead, but Jen didn't seem to mind. She sat still, her eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. As Nara worked on her face, she noticed something strange, a deep black bruise on Jen's neck. Nara began to tremble. It was the unmistakable mark of death, something she had seen countless times in the funeral home. Fear enveloped her, and her hands shook uncontrollably. Jen noticed Nara's expression and asked if something was wrong. Nara could only force a smile and continue applying the makeup. Then, as if sensing Nara's discomfort, Jen pointed to the bruise on her neck and said, "The bruise scared you, didn't it?" in a voice filled with sadness. Jen lowered her head and began to tell her story. She had been in love with a man named Sam for over 5 years. They had planned to get married, but when Sam's family found out that she was an orphan living in a foster home, they opposed the marriage. Jen chose to end her life at a cliff, near her home. Tears welled up in Nara's eyes as she listened to the tragic story, but her fear deepened. She stepped back in horror, pressing herself against the wall, trembling from head to toe. Then, the smell of decay began to fill the room, like the odor of a decomposing body. Jen demanded that Nara finish the makeup so she could confront Sam, but Nara urged her to let go of her hatred and find peace. Jen grabbed Nara by the neck, her cold fingers tightening around her throat. Nara struggled to breathe. Then, Jen released her and threatened, "Make me beautiful, and I'll let you live." With trembling hands, Nara continued the makeup as quickly as she could. When she was done, Jen slowly smiled. Just as Nara thought she could leave, Jen blew a cold breath into her face, causing her to pass out. When she woke up, it was morning, and Nara found herself lying cold on the floor of the morgue. Confused and disoriented, she got up. On the table lay Jen's face, perfectly made up, just as Nara had done the night before. The events of the previous night flooded back into Nara's mind. Dazed, she stumbled out of the morgue and ran home, calling her manager to request the day off. That evening, the news reported a disturbing story. On the day of his wedding, a man named Sam had gone mad. Nara quickly turned off the TV because she knew exactly who was behind it. The next day, she quit her job at the funeral home and found a new position at a bridal makeup shop, hoping she would never experience anything like that again. The old classroom was sealed off. It was my senior year of high school when the rumors about room 217 started circulating. Room 217 was an old, unused classroom tucked away at the end of the third-floor hallway, sealed off for as long as anyone could remember. The door was always locked, the windows covered in thick layers of dust. Students whispered about it in hushed tones, claiming it was haunted, though no one seemed to know why. One rainy afternoon, after staying late for an after-school project, my curiosity got the best of me. My friends had all gone home, and the school was eerily quiet. As I packed up my things, I realized I had left my notebook in the library. On my way back to get it, I wandered down the third-floor hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The scene was so empty and scary. When I reached the end of the hall, there it was, room 217. The door looked like it hadn't been touched in years, the wood cracked and the brass handle tarnished. But to my surprise, as I approached, I heard a faint noise coming from inside, indistinct whispers. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear more clearly. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was whispering behind that door. My pulse quickened as I stood there, unsure whether to leave or investigate. Against my better judgment, I reached for the doorknob, fully expecting it to be locked. It wasn't. The lock was completely rusted and no longer worked. The door creaked open with a low groan, revealing the dark, abandoned classroom inside. Desks were scattered haphazardly, chairs overturned, as if the room had been left in a hurry. Dust particles floated in the pale light that filtered through the dirty windows, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. As I stepped inside, the whispering grew louder. It seemed to come from every corner of the room, though I couldn't make out any specific words. I scanned the room, but there was no one there. My heart raced, my hands trembling as I reached for the nearest desk, half expecting something to leap out at me. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I was locked in. The whispering grew frantic, almost angry, as if the unseen voices were arguing among themselves. My chest tightened with panic, and I backed away toward the windows, desperate to find a way out. But the windows wouldn't budge, sealed shut by years of grime and rust. Then I saw it. On the far side of the room, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting on the chalkboard, was a message: "Get out." The air grew colder, and the whispers intensified. They were louder now, furious, as if urging me to leave. But the door remained locked. My head spun, the pressure building in my ears. I was trapped. My legs felt like they were rooted to the floor, and fear gripped me like a vice. In a last desperate attempt, I ran to the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, like a chorus of angry voices all speaking at once, filling the room with their fury. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and every hair on my body stood on end.
Just when I thought I would pass out from fear, the door swung open with a violent force, and I stumbled out into the hallway. The whispering stopped instantly, leaving behind an oppressive silence. I didn't look back. I ran down the stairs, out of the building, and straight home without stopping. The next day, I told a teacher what had happened, hoping they would check the room. But when we returned to room 217, the door was locked once more, and the classroom looked undisturbed. No one believed my story. For the rest of the year, I avoided the third floor altogether. But even now, years later, I still hear the whispers in my nightmares. Something was in that room, something that wanted me gone, and I'll never forget the terror that filled my heart in the whispering classroom.
Strangers in the online classroom. Online classes have now become a part of our academic lives, and no matter how much I try to adapt, I still prefer in-person learning because it helps me focus better. I live alone in a small rented apartment, away from my family. That day, my last class ended at 9 p.m. I pretended to pay attention, but in reality, I was scrolling through my phone under the desk, sipping on an energy drink to stay awake. The lecture went on, and I barely listened. The class was about to end, and as soon as my teacher logged out, a few friends and I decided to stick around and chat. We were joking around, unwinding after a long day when suddenly, something strange happened. The familiar sound of someone joining the conversation echoed through my headphones. A new name appeared, Tim OO. None of us knew who this was, but we thought it was just one of our friends playing a prank on us. At first, it was funny. We laughed, waiting for them to reveal their identity. The camera on this new person's feed turned on, but the screen was pitch black. We couldn't see anything, and all we could hear was heavy, raspy breathing through the microphone. One of my friends, Thomas, decided to break the tension by mocking the situation. He joked,
"Oh no, I'm so scared."
Our laughter was forced, half-hearted at best. Then the stranger spoke. The voice didn't sound entirely human. It was deep, distorted, as if they were using a voice modulator. My body went cold, and my skin tingled with fear. The laughter stopped. No one said a word. Thomas asked, his voice trembling,
"Who are you?"
I wanted to believe it was still a joke, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The screen shifted. Something moved forward. Now I could see more, just enough to make out a face. But the face was wrong. It was distorted, twisted. One eye was higher than the other, and the mouth curved into a bizarre grin. The low-resolution camera made it even creepier, as if the features were shifting, morphing before my eyes. I wanted to believe it was a mask, but it didn't look like one. My heart pounded in my chest, cold sweat trickling down my forehead. Thomas wasn't laughing anymore. No one was. We were frozen, staring at this grotesque figure, unable to look away. Then the stranger spoke again, this time calling Thomas by name. I got goosebumps when he said,
"Because you've been so mean to me, I'll punish you first."
Thomas turned pale. His nickname in the chat was just Student 17. There was no way this person could know his real name. My mind was spinning. Who was this person? How did they know Thomas's name? I could hear him gasping through the mic, his voice shaking as he stammered.
How do you know my name?
The screen flickered again, and the image disappeared. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting, trying to make out the faint image. I messaged Thomas in a private chat, asking if he was okay, but fear gnawed at me. What if this wasn't just a joke? What if that person knew where Thomas lived? What if they knew where I lived? Wet, dragging footsteps echoed through the speakers, growing louder, closer. Suddenly, the figure leaned in, its grotesque face filling the screen. The camera was now so close that I could see every horrifying detail: cracked and peeling skin, hollow, white, soulless eyes. We screamed in panic. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I shouted for Thomas to log out and escape. Without hesitation, we shut the laptop. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was about to leap out of my chest. I double-checked, quickly locking all the windows and doors. I grabbed my phone to check on Thomas, to make sure he was okay. But as I did, I felt something in my room. I knew it was irrational, just my mind playing tricks on me, but the fear was real. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that deformed, decaying face staring at me from the darkness. Even though the call had ended, the fear lingered. The next morning, I texted Thomas, and a wave of relief washed over me when he finally replied. He was safe. Nothing had happened to him overnight, but none of us could shake the lingering terror. We told our teacher about what had happened, but no one could explain it. And just like my classmates, no one confessed to playing this prank. No one could tell us who Tim OO was or how he had entered our chat. Days passed, but the fear lingered, clinging to me like a shadow. Every time I logged into class, I checked the participants list. I still couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Maybe he was out there, watching us.